Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, queridos amigos, thank you very much for your attendance today. My name is Ignacio Peiró, and I am the director of the Instituto Cervantes in London. I will keep my words extremely short, but I wanted to welcome you to this third installment of our Rethinking the World Today series, a joint effort with our friends and partners of the Cañada Blanc Center at the LSE and its director, Professor Andrés Rodríguez Posse. This talk was going to be hosted at the Instituto, but alas, we had to change it to online mode. And in fact, I have had to connect from Seville in southern Spain, where we have launched the Flamenco Festival and the World Flamenco Congress this morning. Both events will have, I hope, a huge visibility in London at the end of this month. It is in any case a privilege to be surrounded today by some of the most distinguished Spanish scholars in the English-speaking world. And I want to thank Professor Rodríguez Posse for his support. And today in particular, I also want to express our heartfelt gracias, a very special gracias to Professor Mauro Guillén, who will be introduced by Andrés Rodríguez Posse in a minute. Professor Guillén, it really is an honor to have you, someone of your standing with us today. And we're all looking forward to listening to your talk and accompany you through the challenges and opportunities that contemporary economy brings us. And that's all from me. I promised I was going to keep it very short. And now Professor Rodríguez Posse has the floor for a more juicy introduction to the Professor Mauro Guillén. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. It's really a great pleasure to be co-hosting this series with the Instituto Cervantes, the Instituto Cervantes London. And I think this is the third installment, but I hope this will continue, and this will continue for the foreseeable future. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mauro Guillén, who I think needs no introduction because he is probably one of the best known social scientists, not just Spanish social scientists abroad, but also social scientists in general, without further introduction. He is someone who has a wide trajectory. He is the president of the Princess of Asturias Foundation. He is the dean and professor of management studies at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. And he's also professor emeritus of management and sociology at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where he served for 12 years as director of the Joseph H. Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies. He holds two PhDs, one in sociology from Yale University and a doctorate in economic and business sciences from the University of Oviedo. He covers a wide range of topics, and more specifically, his scholarly research deals with globalization, geopolitics, multinational corporations, digital platforms, and modernist architecture as an artistic movement. He has authored a dozen books that have been translated into a total of 17 languages, and his online courses have attracted over 100,000 participants. He is a highly recognized scholar, having received Fulbright, Rockefeller, and Guggenheim fellowships, and research prizes from the Academy of Management, the American Sociological Association, the Social Science History Association, and the Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights. He is a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and an elected member of the Sociological Research Association and the Macro-Organizational Behavioral Society, and a winner of the Aspen Institute's Faculty Pioneer Award. But even more than that, he's a very, very sharp and pioneering scholar, someone who has always pushed the frontiers of our knowledge. And it's going to be our pleasure to listen to him today talking about the topic that I think is becoming far more important by the day, which is the new business landscape. So Mauro, when you have a moment, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Andres, for your kind introduction. I feel today as if I am among friends and peers, and this is truly wonderful to be able to do this, to reach all of you virtually. And thank you as well, Ignacio, for inviting me to this distinguished series, and to the Cervantes Institute. It's, as I said, really a pleasure. I'm speaking from my home in Cambridge in the UK. I wished I could be in London today, but we decided in the last minute to turn this into a virtual event. And I would like to take advantage of the situation and share with you my some of the thoughts that are animating the book that I'm working on now, which hopefully will be finished in the next few months and will be published in 2023. But I want to give you a sense as to what's in it through the lens of what's going on in the business landscape. The book is not just about the business landscape, but it is about how society as a whole is changing in the wake of all of the transformations that some of which were already taking place before the pandemic, and others have been generated from scratch by the pandemic. Let me share the slides that I had prepared for this, and also say that I would be very happy to share the PowerPoints with anybody who would like to have them. So I'm hoping that you can now see the slides. If not, please correct me. Is that correct? Let me tell you about essentially 5, I believe, interrelated trends, things that are going on in the business landscape. I am not going to talk that much about technological change per se. You will notice that technological change is behind, at least in part, some of the most of the trends that I'm going to be telling you about. I want to focus your attention more on 5 other things. The great blurring, and I'll explain in a moment what that means. Changes in supply chains, which of course are creating not just business problems, but also economic, political, and even social upheavals in the world right now. I'd like to tell you about automation and what may happen next in that area. And finally, I want to tell you about remote work and changes in demographics that I think are going to be changing both the labor market and consumer markets around the world. So once again, please let me know, Andres, if you cannot see the slides. I'm assuming
we can see the slides without any problem.
Thank you so much. So the first topic that I want to tell you about is the great blurring. So let me explain. About 300 years ago, this country, England, pioneered the Industrial Revolution. And since then, we've been defining industries in terms of the products or the services that they offer in the marketplace. So we have the textile industry, we have the clothing industry, we have the food industry, we have the steel industry, and so on and so forth. But now, especially over the last 20 years, what we're increasingly seeing is that industry boundaries are becoming much more porous with the increasing complexity of economic activity. That is to say, it is not as easy to determine what kinds of activities, what kinds of people are working, for example, within, let's say, the automobile industry or the metalworking industry, and so on and so forth. What we have is increasingly as well new products that challenge traditional categories. For example, electric cars. Are they part of the automobile industry? Or are we talking about the electronics industry? And so on and so forth. And underlying all of this is a longer-term trend coming from customers, coming from the demand side of the economy, whereby customers, consumers, no longer want products or services. What they're demanding is solutions to whatever needs or problems they have. So let me just tell you what's behind this. What's behind this is a mix of a very long list of trends and events. One is deregulation. Another one is globalization. Certainly scientific development, because as you know, science and technology nowadays increasingly happens in an interdisciplinary context whereby biologists join forces with computer scientists and with chemists to come up with new breakthroughs in science. We also have information technology, which has essentially changed the rules of the game across many industries and has tended in general, as I was mentioning earlier, to blur some of the boundaries that separate industries. In addition to economies of scale, which were, of course, a major force behind the Industrial Revolution, now what we have is also network effects. Let me just explain this very quickly. Economies of scale is all about how you can reduce cost, total cost. That is, if you increase your volume of production. So the more you produce, the lower the cost. And that's, of course, because you're able to spread fixed cost over a larger number of units. But network effects is a new phenomenon. Well, it's not new, but it has certainly gained in importance over the last 20 years or so with the popularization of digital platforms. Network effects occur when the value of using a certain platform or using a product or a service increases with each additional user. That is to say, an existing user benefits from the addition of new users. Network effects, I think, manifested themselves for the first time in a big way with the telegraph and the telephone. The more people were using the telegraph or the telephone, the more useful this new communication technology became for every existing user. Those are network effects. Now, what we also have today or nowadays is the phenomenon of ecosystems. So instead of industries, we have ecosystems, but ecosystems include many different kinds of industries, many different kinds of support organizations, as well as other organizations or companies that offer products and services to the market. So in other words, companies today exist not so much in industries, but rather in ecosystems. And lastly, the nature of competition has also changed, with companies entering each other's turf and competing across industry boundaries in many very interesting ways. So let me offer you some examples of this cross-boundary competition. For example, I frequently tell my students banks are competing with fintechs. We all know that. Fintechs are these new startups that are using essentially electronic information technology, especially smartphones, apps, to deliver financial services. But they also compete, these banks also compete against, for example, accommodation platforms such as Airbnb. So maybe the reason why this is the case is not as readily obvious. So let me just tell you more about it. Banks, for example, offer home equity lines, or they also offer reverse mortgages, products that, by the way, are gaining in acceptance, not just in markets such as the UK, but also in Spain. So that's one way in which people can monetize the most important asset that they have, which is their home, right? So they can get a home equity line from the bank and, in other words, borrow against their home, or they can sign a contract called a reverse mortgage, whereby the bank today pays you a lump sum, but then when you pass away, or when both spouses pass away, then what happens is that the home, instead of being yours or your heirs, becomes the property of the bank. So in other words, you're monetizing the asset today, knowing that, or giving away your right of ownership of that asset. But you see, Airbnb offers an alternative way of monetizing your home as an asset, meaning that the owner of the home can rent the entire home or a room or two within the home on Airbnb as a platform. And that way it can obtain an income from that asset. So in other words, banks have then become or come into competition, not just with fintechs as platforms or apps offering financial services, but also with other kinds of platforms such as Airbnb, those that offer accommodation services. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that the traditional boundaries no longer hold. That is to say that we're seeing increasingly cross-boundary competition. We also see this phenomenon, another manifestation of this phenomenon is when consumers are asked to be producers. So in other words, you involve the consumer in the production of the good or the service. These days, you can go to the website of a company and you can design your own car there. Or you can go to IKEA, this is an older example, and purchase, let's say, a bed or a sofa bed, and under the assumption that you'll put it together at home. So you're assembling the final product. There's also the more recent phenomenon of user-generated content. We have so many digital platforms where the consumer is generating content for the platform. So actually the company or the organization behind the platform doesn't have to generate content because the user is doing that. We also have sharing platforms where it goes without saying there's also an involvement of the consumer in production. And finally, another part of this brave new economy, which I think is going to develop very quickly in the next few years, 3D printing, is also something that involves the consumer in production. So whenever we see this happening, we are witnessing the traditional boundaries of industries vanish before our eyes. And by the way, the meaning of products themselves is changing. So consider the example of photography. So we used to take pictures and then develop them using chemical means. But now, of course, we have digital photography. But think about the following. The crucial advantage of digital photography is not lower cost, which is true. The cost is lower than for chemical photography, or immediacy, but it is the ability to share. So I would urge you, if you're listening now, to think about how many photographs you have printed over the last, let's say, month or so. And maybe, you've printed one or two, if at all. But if you think now about how many photographs that you've taken with your mobile phone, you've shared with other people, maybe through a social media platform such as WhatsApp, I'm pretty sure that most of you would say, well, I shared just about a dozen of them in the last half hour, right? So that is really what has changed. And therefore, the photography industry today spans not just photography, but also telecommunications, social media, and so many other industries. So that's another example of what's going on in the business landscape. And we also have the transformation of products themselves. Consider the example of the watch, the wristwatch. So this is something that came into being in the second half of the 19th century. And there's a big discussion big debate among historians as to whether this innovation originated from Switzerland, from the UK, or from Brazil, with most of the evidence indicating that it originated from Switzerland. So I'm talking about not the clock, not the watch, but rather the wristwatch, not the pocket watch, the wristwatch. Well, originally, this was just a timepiece. But then, over time, it became a fashion accessory. And then about 20 or 30 years ago, it became a mini computer. And nowadays, with the Apple Watch, with the smartwatches around, it has become a communications device, and it has become a networking device. So we see that this blurring of industry boundaries has led to many changes. The involvement of consumers in production has led to the transformation of industries. It has also led to the transformations of what we consider to be products. And I believe it is something that will continue to revolutionize the economy. And it actually begs a very important question. Why do we continue to have industrial policies focused on certain specific industries? Why do we continue, for example, to have collective bargaining and wage determination mechanisms in many countries around the world at the industry level? Why do we continue to have labor unions negotiate wages and other working conditions with employers on an industry by industry basis? The economy is changing. I think these industrial boundaries will continue to become less and less relevant into the future. Second thing that I would like to put on the table here for discussion, and in about 25 minutes or so, we're going to go into Q&A. So please think about what questions or what comments you would like to make to what I'm saying, is supply chains. I don't need to tell you how important this topic has become. If you go to a supermarket, you will notice that there are more empty shelves nowadays than, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago. If you go to a store, you will notice that some items are on back order. If you go online, you will notice that sometimes companies that used to promise 2-hour delivery to your home now tell you that the item is not available. Well, let me show you a chart that I think tells the story in a very, very straightforward way. It's a chart about the American economy. The US has very good statistics on a very important magnitude, which I'm going to define for you. You can see at the top of the chart, it says US total monthly inventory to sales ratio. So let me unpack that for you. So here, essentially, what we're measuring on a month-by-month basis is for all American firms, what is the value of the inventories that they're holding, let's say, at the end of the month, okay? And then we divide that number by the revenue figure during that month, okay? So this gives us a sense as to the extent to which American companies over time are holding inventory relative to the amount of sales that they're making. So the chart begins in the year 1992 and goes all the way up until about a couple of months ago, so in early 2022. And as you can see, there are 3 distinct stages or phases or periods. The first one started in 1992 and went all the way to the onset of the last global financial crisis in the year 2008, if you remember, when Lehman Brothers collapsed in September of 2008. I call it the just-in-time era for a very simple reason, because as you can see over time, with a few fluctuations here and there, American companies were holding less inventory for every level of sales, which means essentially that we're becoming more efficient. So they wouldn't store a lot of goods or services, right? They would essentially just try to procure what they wanted to sell just in time in order to deliver it to the customer. Or if we're talking here about manufacturing firms or about hospitals that need supplies, they would only get the supplies just in time to produce either the good or to produce the service, in the case of the hospital, to deliver healthcare services. Now, the global financial crisis produced a very, very immediate effect on the trend here by making the ratio of inventory to sales go through the roof, as you can see in peaking in the year at the beginning of 2009. I hope that you can see my computer cursor. Now, that happened, of course, because as a result of the crisis, demand plummeted, and therefore the denominator in this ratio declined very quickly, and therefore the ratio increased extremely quickly. Now, after a year or so, things went back to normal, meaning to the pre-existing level, as you can see. But as you can also observe on the chart, after 2010, a very different trend took place, and it was an increasing trend. So in other words, for a number of reasons that I'm going to tell you about in a moment, American firms started to hold more inventory, not less inventory. Now, the reasons were very simple. First, what you had was uncertainty, just in general. And so, therefore, you would prefer to have a little bit more inventory on hand. Secondly, we started to see geopolitical turmoil occur in the world in the form, especially after 2014, of trade wars between the US and China, between the US and Europe, and so on and so forth. And then there were also some natural disasters, like the famous accident, nuclear accident in Fukushima, Japan, which, if you remember, was triggered by an earthquake and tsunami. And that earthquake and tsunami disrupted logistics in Japan, and Japan being the second biggest manufacturing economy in the world, not being able to deliver to the rest of the world many parts and components that were needed by other companies to put their own products together, essentially meant that there was this added problem. And therefore, companies, for example, in the United States, as we can see on the chart, decided to hold more inventory. Now, with the pandemic, the trend also got disrupted. The pandemic, if you remember, began in Europe and the United States, roughly speaking, in the month of March in a big way. That was when the first lockdowns took place of the year 2020. And what you can see is that the ratio peaked once again in April, on April 1st of 2020. And that was because once again, the denominator, the sales, plummeted because at the beginning, during the lockdown phase, there was a dramatic decline in demand. But look at what has happened since then over the last couple of years. The ratio, instead of recovering, and in the midst of all of the uncertainty geopolitically that continues in the world, has not continued to increase, but rather it has taken a very sharp turn downwards. And this is, of course, what gets reflected today in the form of empty shelves, in the form of orders on the part of customers that cannot be fulfilled online, and so on and so forth. So why has this happened? What are the sources of these disruptions? Well, I would submit the following. First, there was an underestimation of how quickly demand would recover. And this was particularly true in the US, in Europe, in the automobile sector. And if you remember, in the automobile sector, what has been making it very difficult for companies to have enough products ready for sale has been a shortage of chips, of semiconductors, which, by the way, also explains why companies such as Tesla have had a much better time in terms of delivering automobiles. Because if you remember, just before the pandemic, they made a very important decision, which was to make most of their chips in-house as opposed to rely on suppliers. Now, the other issue that happened was that there was a surge as a result of the lockdowns and the pandemic in the demand for home consumption, for toilet paper, for food, for all sorts of things, personal items. Now, you may not believe me when I say that the problem here was not a lack of capacity in terms of producing those goods. I mean, we were eating things, but we're not eating them at home. We were eating them at the office, or we were eating them at a restaurant, and so on and so forth. And the problem whenever we're talking about food or about personal care items and so on, or toilet paper during the pandemic, has been the containers in which those products are sold. When those products are sold at a restaurant or at the office, right? Because, for example, we go to the toilet in the office and we need toilet paper there. The containers in which they're sold are much bigger. For home consumption, the containers, when you go to a supermarket and you buy these things, are much smaller. And the supply chains, the companies out there, weren't prepared for such a sudden change in the average container size in which they were supposed to place all of these products that everybody needed in order to continue living their lives. Now, another reason was a lack of preparation for pent-up demand. If you remember, in many parts of the world, but most markedly in the United States, the economy recovered very, very quickly from the first initial shock of the pandemic in terms of the demand. And there was a lack of preparation on the part of many companies for pent-up demand. By the way, we're seeing this right now here in the United Kingdom in the service sector. If you remember, the airlines decided to lay off large numbers of people. But over the last few weeks, with the removal of some of the remaining restrictions to the free movement of people in many countries around the world without COVID tests and so on and so forth, led the airline companies over the last 2 or 3 months to sell more tickets than they could actually deliver now, as people are starting to take those trips, perhaps going on vacation and so on and so forth. So in other words, a lack of preparation for pent-up demand that manifested itself in the manufacturing sector. I mentioned just a moment ago the example of automobiles, but also in the service sector, most notably in the travel industry and in the airlines. Now, we've continued to have geopolitical factors behind all of these, the trade wars, and if that weren't enough, we've had labor shortages due to the pandemic across many industries, coupled with another issue, which is that, as you know, immigration has been slowing down as a result of two causes. One has been a political backlash in many countries against it, and secondly, the concerns about migration in the midst of a pandemic. And if that weren't enough, in addition to everything that I've already mentioned, we also had this rare event in the Suez Canal in March of 2021, if you remember, that a large container ship got stranded, and for 2 or 3 days, the Suez Canal remained closed, and that essentially wreaked havoc in global shipping because the containers and the ships and everything else were in the wrong place at the wrong time after that incident. I would also argue that travel bans have become really difficult or have added to the problem here in the following sense, which is that the reduction in business travel in particular has made it far more difficult for companies to rebuild their supply chains, to essentially look for alternative sources of supply, because you don't want to just have a Zoom meeting, meet your new supplier and go ahead and sign a contract. You want to go, you want to visit that supplier. Maybe the supplier is 1,000 miles away, maybe the supplier is 6,000 miles away. You want to be able to inspect the factory. You want to make sure that the work will be done according to specifications and so on and so forth. So all of the difficulties in terms of communication and travel in the wake of the pandemic, I think, have added to this problem. So what's going to happen with supply chains? And this, of course, will have a big impact, not just on the economy and business, but also politics, and could bring about social unrest. Well, I think we're going to be moving away permanently from just-in-time supply chains to just in case there's an earthquake, just in case there's a pandemic, just in case there's a trade war, just in case something else happens that could disrupt global supply chains. I think companies will seek to create redundancies. They're going to try to diversify their supply chain, but also they're going to be creating buffers in the form of higher levels of inventory. Now, those of you who have worked at a company, you will know that whenever you're holding more inventory, there are 5 categories of cost that go up, okay? Because you have to have space for holding the inventory. There's the cost of obsolescence. There's a financing cost of holding inventory, and so on and so forth. Now, what this means essentially is that we're going to see one of 2 extreme outcomes, or some linear combination between the 2. Either those additional costs of holding higher inventory are passed on to the consumer, okay, in the form of higher prices, or they are passed on to the shareholders of the firm in the form of reduced profits, or of course, some combination, linear combination between the 2. And where exactly in the end the solution is will depend on, to a very large measure, to what extent the company can impose prices, to what extent companies have monopolistic power in the market. If they do have monopolistic power, they will seek to pass on the costs to the consumer. And this is, by the way, what we're seeing already in certain industries. So in other words, the 4th point that you see on the screen, companies are going to try to strike a different balance between efficiency and reliability, or resilience. So the name of the game in supply chains right now is not so much efficiency, reducing costs, as it is resiliency, making sure that you have what you need in terms of parts, components, or final products available to you whenever you need it. And point number 5, I think we're going to see, as a result of all of the above, a major restructuring of supply chains globally, in the geographical sense of the term, in the sense that companies are going to shorten their supply chains. Instead of sourcing components or parts or products from Asia, for, let's say, the case of a British company, they're going to look for suppliers that are much closer. In the case of American firms, we've seen a lot of movement already in terms of, or shifting in terms of companies increasingly using Mexico and other parts of Central America and South America as potential suppliers in an attempt to reduce the reliance on longer supply chains stretching all the way to Asia, for example. Now, 3rd topic that I want to put on the table, this one is a little bit shorter, automation. I think the pandemic has created new incentives for automation, once again, geared towards building resiliency. Remember the famous stories during the pandemic about food processing companies not having enough employees and therefore having to shut down, not having enough employees because, of course, too many of them were reporting sick. The same thing, of course, has been happening at hospitals, has been happening at universities, has been happening throughout, not just the manufacturing economy, but also the service sector. So I think the pandemic has introduced additional incentives for automation in manufacturing, which, of course, had already made quite a bit of headway, automation in the sense of, with the use of robotics. But I think this is going to also create a new wave of innovation in the service sector, including customer-facing jobs, not just back office operations. So we're going to see this in hospitality, in hotels. We're going to see it in healthcare, especially with the phenomenon of telemedicine. We're going to see it in education, I think, on an ongoing basis, with legal work, with office work, with retail trade. And when it comes to automation, I didn't put it on the PowerPoint, but remember that the big leap forward here in terms of automation in the service sector will come from artificial intelligence, from AI. That, I think, is going to be the next frontier when it comes to automation in services. Now, 4th topic that I want to put on the table here for debate is remote work. So we had a few experiments in terms of remote work before the pandemic, but the pandemic created the conditions for a huge experiment involving both employees and employers regarding remote work. So much so that we came to a situation in which nearly half of all employees were working remotely 100% of the time during certain periods of the last couple of years. Now, I don't want to bore you with the pros and the cons of remote work. You can go over the different points that you see here on the slides. But what I want to focus your attention is on what might be some of the longer term implications of not necessarily remote work, but certainly of hybrid work, which is what I think right now most employers are thinking about, which is how can we combine the strengths or the advantages of remote work with some of the traditional reasons why we're asking people to actually show up at the office or show up at the place of work. I think we're going to see a second big wave in offshoring, but one that is fundamentally different from the first that we saw in the 1980s and 1990s, which, if you remember, was mostly about IT work with the famous offshoring operations in India, for example, or it was also about back office work, right? Meaning, for example, processing certain kinds of things which could be done on an offshoring basis very easily. Now I think we're going to be moving into a brave new world in which the fact that we've learned over the last 2 years how to perform, how jobs can be performed from a distance opens up a number of new possibilities. Let me just offer you an example. Let's say that a company based here in the UK would like to add another marketing expert to their already existing team of, let's say, 10 marketing employees. And they advertise the position, and they happen to find the best person, the best fit for the job in somebody who lives in Singapore. Now, typically, you would ask that person to move to the UK so that that person can work with your existing employees in that team. But today we have another option, which is if that is truly the best person for the job, you could tell that person, okay, so why don't you work remotely from Singapore, as long as you don't mind working during odd hours of the day? And you can stay there. Your kids don't have to move to a different country. They don't have to attend a completely different educational system. Moreover, your spouse or your partner doesn't have to move with you either. I think that opens up new possibilities. And whenever I speak these days to human resource managers or talent managers at different kinds of companies and organizations, they're telling me that they're increasingly looking into this possibility, and they have already made hires on a remote basis. So I think, and I put a question mark at the end, the last bullet point that you see on the slide, I think we may be witnessing the emergence for the first time of a truly global market for talent. Once again, subject to some of the limitations that remote work has. Okay, so I don't want to give you the impression that I am oblivious to the limitations, to the shortcomings of remote work. There are many of them, and they are substantial, and they can be damaging. But once again, I think the mindset amongst companies right now, in the midst of, as you know, a very tight labor market, both in several European countries and the United States, is that we need to be creative, we need to explore new possibilities, and that remote work is certainly part, or will continue to be part of the future. Now, the last point that I want to make very quickly, Andres, is about demographics. So we're all talking about demographics these days, of course, because we realize that the clock is ticking, that the pandemic has further reduced fertility, and that, in other words, population aging is taking place perhaps even faster than we anticipated. So we are living in a world in which the number of babies drops, while at the same time we live longer lives. And I'd like to tell you very briefly here about what I see as the implications for the market and what I see as the implications for consumer markets and for the labor market. So first, let me just give you a sense as to how quickly things might be changing. Here you see a table on the left, which shows you how many millions of people between the ages of 15 and 35, the largest countries in the world, had as of the end of 2020. And what is the medium projection by the UN as to how many millions of people, again, within those ages, the largest countries in the world will have by the year 2030? If you examine the table carefully, you will notice that there are three types of countries. There are countries like India or Nigeria that are going to have even more people between the ages of 15 and 35 in the future. Okay, so these are going to be growth markets from all points of view. Now, there's a second category of countries, such as the United States, where you examine the numbers carefully, there's a stagnation. So it's roughly speaking the same number of people in that age group in 8 years from now as the number that we had at the end of 2020. And by the way, the UK would be in this same category. Okay, so the US and the UK would be in this category. Now, that doesn't mean nothing is going to change. What's going to change, of course, is the composition of that age group. And it's going to change in the direction of more ethnic and racial diversity. In the United States, the US Bureau of the Census predicts by the year 2030, the groups that today we call minorities are going to be the majority. They're going to be more than 50% in this younger age group by the year 2030. Now, what that means is that there's going to be very, very big changes in the economy, let alone politics as a result of this. But in the economy, I can tell you, the big changes will come from the behavior of those groups, because we know that minorities in the United States, so I'm referring to Latinos, I'm referring to African Americans, Asian Americans, and so on, they tend to marry at an earlier age. And they also, adjusting for income level, they're more likely to purchase a car or to purchase a home. And think about it. The three most important financial decisions that everybody makes in life are to get married or to start living with another person, okay? Secondly, to buy a home, and third, to buy a car. And everything else, right? Everything else in terms of our behavior as consumers. And I might add also our political behavior and our social behavior changes after we've made those decisions, okay? And so if you now have among the young people in places like the United States or the United Kingdom, more minorities, right? Meaning that you have more of this diversity. And you know that those groups tend to be different in terms of the moment in their lives at which they make those decisions, then that's going to have major implications for the market, as well as for many other things. And then the third type of country that you can find on the table are countries like China or Japan or South Korea or even Brazil, where they're going to have dramatically fewer young people by the year 2030. Look at China, for example, they're going to have 60 million fewer people. So very different dynamics. And that's what I always tell people, whether you are into marketing or you are into politics, like you're trying to understand what might be the outcome of the next election, or whether you're just trying to understand society, you've got to take this into consideration. The numbers of young people in different countries in the world are going to be very different compared to what we have today, even just 8 or 10 years down the road. And then, Andres, just one last thing here, a couple of very quick last points. If you take a look, however, at the other end of the age distribution, the population above the age of 60. So here you have the table for, again, 2020 and 2030. How many millions of people, the largest countries in the world, are going to have above the age of 60? Here, there's only one type of country, okay? Every country in the world is going to have more people above the age of 60 by the year 2030. And not only that, by the year 2030, the largest segment in the consumer market is going to be people above the age of 60. Whereas in history, before this time we're going through now, the largest consumer segment always was that of young people. But now with the falling number of babies and with the increase in life expectancy, the situation has completely flipped. Last point that I want to make here last point about this table that I'm going to make. Not only it's going to be the largest segment in the market, also I want to give you another factoid that I think is really important for the economy, for politics, and for society, specifically for income inequality. Between 60 and 80% of the net worth in the world is owned by people above the age of 60. Let me repeat that, between 60 and 80%. The outlier here is the United States, which is more towards the 80% end of the interval. Most other countries are closer to the 60%, including the UK or including Spain. But there's going to be a fundamental new source of inequality, which is that between old and young in the world, okay? And remember, people above at age 60, they still have on average in the UK or in Spain another 24 years to live. So we're not talking about people who will be passing away anytime soon. They're going to be around for a long time, and that period is getting longer. So last point, Andres, if you allow me. So let me put together all of these things. And let me just point out one implication that I think is going to change quite a few things in society and in the economy. You see, for the last 140 years, since Bismarck in Germany, we've been organizing our lives in terms of what I would call a sequential or a stage model. So first we play, then we study, then we work, and then we retire. That's it, okay? So sequential stages in life. But now 3 big changes. I've already talked about life expectancy after age 60. So it's about 24 years here in the UK or in Spain. The health span has also expanded. So in other words, a 60-year-old today is in much better physical and mental shape than a 60-year-old 2 or 3 generations ago. And then the third big change, technological transformations are making whatever it is that we learn at school obsolete or antiquated much faster than in the past. So what's the implication of this? My prediction is that if you put together these 3 trends, then what's going to happen is that instead of going to school once, people are going to go to school several times during their lifetime. By age 40, they will realize that whatever they learned at age 20 is no longer as useful in the labor market. So they will go back to work, to study, perhaps through a digital platform. Then they will continue to work. And by age 60, they will realize that in the future, they may have another 30 years ahead of them. And they don't want to be bored, but more importantly, they don't have enough money set aside in their pension fund, and the state pension, the public pension won't be enough either. And so they will go back to school again. Right now in China, there are 70 million people, that's 70 million people above the age of 60 who are back in university. So if people go back to school multiple times, there's nothing preventing them also from switching careers. Now, in order for this to happen, we did several things to concur in time. It's not just that individuals feel the need, it's also that companies need to change their attitude towards older workers, and also that governments need to change regulations about older workers. So, Andres, as I said at the beginning, I think we're going through major transformations in the business landscape. They're going to have implications not just for the economy and for companies themselves, but also for society as a whole and for politics and so on and so forth. But let me stop there in the interest of having at least I can see 10 minutes for Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Mauro. I'm sure that if we were all in London, there would be a big clap because it has been an excellent presentation. You raised far too many issues for me to cover. But as you mentioned in your presentation, or I wrote in the chat once you were starting, if anyone wants to ask any questions to Professor Mauro Guillén, please put them in the chat and I will relay them. But let me just start and take my privilege to deal with some of the issues that you have been highlighting, which I think are important, extremely important, especially because they have significant consequences that go beyond just production and economic growth, but go into attitudes and also into inequality. And you mentioned one of them is the role of platform economies, the platform economy as it is now, which in many ways is concentrating wealth to a level that we have never seen before in history. To give you an idea, 50 years ago, we had the second largest company in the world was General Motors. It had 800,000 workers, plants all over the world, and it had upstream and downstream activities that actually generated wealth across many layers of society and in many places, not just in the United States, but also in many countries in what was then, let's say, the free world. By comparison, if we take, for example, one of the largest companies in this platform economy, let's take now Facebook, for example. Facebook just a few years ago had, I think 2 years ago, had 45,000 workers, but it had a massive amount of value in terms of the share market, and also had levels of profit per employee that were 53 times higher than those of General Motors. Do you think that this is sustainable? And especially taking into account that, for example, we're now all buying Amazon and other sort of online retail companies, but Amazon has 1.5 million workers worldwide, while the retail sector just in Europe is 32 million people.
Yeah. Well, I think, Andres, you're putting your finger on something really important, which is that the digital economy seems to be accelerating change. And it seems to also be or enabling the founders of those companies and the early employees to accumulate wealth that was to levels and that was unimaginable. And it used to take, if you remember, when you ask business historians, it used to take like 2 or 3 generations of a really well-run family business for the family to accumulate, let's say, 1 billion American billion, so 1,000 millions of pounds or of dollars in wealth, right? But these days, not just in financial services with hedge funds, but also, as you're pointing out, in the digital economy, it may take like a young entrepreneur just a couple of years to get to that point. So I think this is because, quite frankly, my explanation is because not just we have economies of scale, but we also have network effects at work. And network effects are just very powerful. And they create such strong first mover advantages. They make it, if you manage the platform correctly, and you're aggressive as an entrepreneur, it makes it so difficult for the second entrant, for the third entrant, for the fourth entrant to catch up with you, right? So I've given some thought to this question that you've been talking about, and I believe it's because we just don't have the effect of economies of scale, which, if you remember, also created huge advantages during the Industrial Revolution up until recently. But in addition to that, we also have network effects, and it's a combination of those two things that really makes the situation completely different now in terms of the speed at which companies can get big. But let me just add one. I'm sure you have other points or other comments that you want to share, or people in the audience, but let me just make another quick comment here, which is, I don't think our regulators, I don't think governments have caught up with this fast enough. I think they're still learning what to do. And it has become a tricky question because, as you know, the issue right now is that American regulators, for example, don't want to kill or to handicap or to introduce or do anything that might put American firms at a disadvantage, because they know they are in a race with primarily Chinese companies, in some cases also European companies. And so I think there's a lot of fear on the part of regulators to deal or to do something about those massive concentrations of power and wealth, because they feel that in some way then maybe the US might lose the race relative to China. So I'm just offering these comments as just footnotes to what you said. I mean, the important point is the one that you made, which is that these technological transformations we're going through have greatly contributed to the accumulation of power and wealth in record time. And this is something that I think is, as you correctly pointed out, very different from what was going on with the Carnegies and the Mellons and the Rockefellers of the world, quite frankly. Although it is certainly true, as you know, that levels of income and wealth inequality are now about to reach the same levels as during that time, 120, 140 years ago. So that's what those who defend the current status quo say. It's like, why are you so concerned about this? I mean, we haven't yet reached the levels of inequality. My answer to that is that perhaps we haven't reached the levels of inequality because now we have a welfare state, right? In many countries, even in the United States, right? So absent that welfare state that certainly didn't exist 140 years ago, I think if we run the numbers, I think right now we would have levels of wealth and income inequality far higher than the ones that prevailed at the time.
Thank you very much. We're starting to have questions from the audience. So there's a question by Linda Sanders. Linda, if you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly, not just unmute, but also open your camera and ask the question directly to Mauro.
I'm being told by my computer that I can't start my video because the host has stopped it.
Please go ahead then.
Okay. Yeah, there we go. Start my video. Okay. So I was very interested. I'm head of a school and secondary school, and when you said that that we will be going back to school multiple times, but my question is, in that first period when you've got primary school, then secondary school, what should they be learning?
Yeah, Linda, that's a great question, and you probably know more about that question than I do. But let me just offer you two, parameters that I think are really important. I think what we should be teaching children in primary school, secondary school, is essentially the ability to learn and unlearn things, because that's going to be really useful to most people.
Yeah.
Now that we're going to have to, we're going to be around for 60 years, 80 years, 100 years as adults. Okay. So the ability to learn and to unlearn, I think really, really important, rather than the ability to store knowledge about certain things, right?
Yeah.
Knowing that, yes, you will need to store some knowledge if you want to be a physician or a doctor, or if you want to be an engineer, or if you want to be a plumber, right? But that maybe you will switch occupations, or you will switch professions or careers. And therefore, the ability to learn, and more importantly, to unlearn older things, obsolete things, I think will be crucial. So second point is, I think that boils down to learning how to read and to write very well, and acquiring familiarity with numbers and with abstract reasoning. For me, those are the essential, I think, things that primary and secondary schools should achieve. Now, obviously, you should add history there, you should add the humanities, because we don't want to just educate people who can be effective at something. We want to educate citizens at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
So that would be my answer to your question, but it's a question that I've thought about, and it is a question that I think is really important. And I think we will need to reform education at all levels.
I agree. Thank you very much.
Now, thank you for your question.
Thank you, Linda. I do have quite a large number of questions, but I'm conscious of time. But let me just start with one about the disruption of supply chains, which is feeding in a weird way, well, not that weird, into inflation. And you highlighted that one of the implications that we are seeing, and that you would expect, would be a shortening of the trade chains geographically, which would be great from an environmental point of view for the sustainability of the planet. But what would that do to inflation in the medium and long term? Yeah. And what would be the political implications of that, especially if then we want to also combat climate change?
Yeah. So, Andres, as you know, there's two parts to the inflation number, right? Core inflation and non-core inflation. And it's still up in the air how much of what's going on has to do with commodity products and with energy, right? As opposed to just more rampant inflation seeping through the entire economy. And part of it driven, as you correctly point out, by bottlenecks in supply chains and so on and so forth. So we still don't know exactly what are the key sources of inflation right now, although I think we will know very, very quickly. And then on top of that, we have the central banks, which of course for 10 or more years have been flooding us with liquidity. There's just too much money out there. And as you know, one definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods or services in the market. So my sense is that this change in supply chains, as I think you were suggesting, or the person who asked the question was suggesting, will not help. There's no question about it. It is not going to help, especially if companies, as I mentioned earlier, have monopolistic power in the market and they can have the end consumer pay for the increased costs of holding more inventory, of shortening the supply chains, of all of these changes that are going on. That's I think, the answer to the question.
Okay, let me just go for what I think would be the final question, because we are already hitting 8 o'clock here in the UK. And you're talking about, the final point was about demographics, which I think is fascinating, is going to be one of the new great challenges. And you have been highlighting very neatly that 60 to 80% of wealth is owned by people above 60. Yet, and that in many countries, what we're going to see has been going to be a reduction of people of working age. Yet, under a welfare state, what we're going to see is that these people are going to be asked to maintain the pensions of people that actually control the majority of wealth. What does that do from a social justice type of perspective, and how can we get out of it if there's a solution to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's going to be intergenerational conflict, and we should start thinking about how to manage it, because as you correctly pointed out, 50 years ago, when we made many of those promises about healthcare, about old age pensions, and so on and so forth, we had 5 or 6 or even 7 people of working age in Europe, for example, for each person above the age of 60. But now we're going into a situation in which we only have 2 people of working age. In Japan, by the year 2040, they're only going to have 1 person of working age for each person above the age of 60. And so some of these promises, I think, are going to be very, very difficult to fulfill. And that's why I was suggesting earlier that people will celebrate their 60th birthday, their 65th birthday. They will notice that they're in much better physical and mental shape than their parents or their grandparents at a similar age. And they will see that they still have another 25, 30, even 35 years on average of life ahead of them. And they will decide, this is no time to retire. I want to continue working. Maybe I will need to go back to school to learn new skills or what have you. So I think that's the most likely outcome, that we're going to have to reconsider the way in which we live our lives, and that retiring at age 60 or 65 or even 67 might be something that on average we won't be able to afford.
Well, thank you very much, Mauro. I think it has been a fascinating sort of talk. As I said, you touch upon quite a lot of issues. And I would like to thank you wholeheartedly for participating in this series. And I think I'm going to now pass on the baton to Ignacio, who is going to close the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres Rodriguez-Pose, and thank you very much, Guillén. Thank you very much, Professor Guillén. It was an extremely insightful talk, and well, this will be available in YouTube, I think, starting tomorrow, for those of you who want to review the many things, the many interesting things that he has said here. So thank you very much, and until the next installment of this series. Thank you. Gracias.